It's 2:30 a.m. on the 16th of May, 1932. The French passenger liner Georges Philippar is en route back to Marseille after a trip to Japan. Monsieur Julien is asleep in his cabin with his family when he hears shouting from a man named Albert Londres in the adjacent cabin. His family, now also awake, notices a light smoke filling their own cabin. He hears the words, "Save me, I cannot open it." Albert Londres was trying to escape out of his porthole, but a complicated series of levers was causing problems for him. The ship was dark. The electricity had gone out, making it even more difficult. Julien could now see flames and smoke. He quickly gathered his wife, sister, and children and led them to the front of the ship. He returned to the cabin to collect the family's belongings, only to become trapped. His only escape was through the cabin's porthole. Julien struggles, using all his strength to exit through the porthole and make it back to his family. He could hear the screams coming from the cabins and now sealed-off passageways. Screams of agony and pain he would never forget. The fiery demise of the Georges Philippar, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. Thank you so much for listening. The French passenger liner Georges Philippar was built by Ateliers et Chantiers de la Loire in Saint-Nazaire, France. She was launched in 1930 and completed in 1932 for the Compagnie des Messageries Maritimes and named after the company's CEO, Georges Philippar. She was 172 meters long with a beam of 20.8 meters and at over 17,000 tons could carry over 1,000 passengers. She offered a first-class dining hall, a conversation lounge, a smoking room, a meeting hall, terraces, a tennis court, and a large swimming pool with a bar. She was luxurious. The company simultaneously built two other almost identical sister ships, the Félix Roussel and the Aramis. Its three new ships were replacing an aging fleet, including the Paul Lacat, which was destroyed by fire in 1928. The ships included some innovative features, such as short, square funnels which the crew jokingly called flower pots. The front funnel was non-functional and merely decorative. The ships also had diesel propulsion, which Philippar named Nautonafs, as he thought diesel sounded too German for the French public. The ships also featured electricity on board. Electricity on ships began in 1880 but was very slow to be adopted. By 1930, ship owners had begun to install electricity on a larger scale. The Georges Philippar and the Félix Roussel were both launched on the 6th of November 1930 at Saint-Nazaire to much celebration. Minister of the Merchant Navy, Louis Rollins, announced, "These are not only, in fact, comfortable and luxurious units, well suited to supporting the prestige of the French flag. They are also, by their technique, essentially modern ships, in particular by the adoption of diesel engines. You have resolutely embarked on the road to motorization, and you should be congratulated." Members of the clergy of Saint-Nazaire blessed the ship. Then a woman named Madame Porsche, a daughter of an agent of the Messageries Maritimes, broke the traditional bottle of champagne on her bow. However, some of the sailors assigned to her weren't thrilled about the name. French sailors believed it to be very bad luck to name a ship after a living person. On the 1st of December, just weeks after being launched, the Georges Philippar experienced a fire in her cold storage area while being fitted out. Considerable damage was done, and repairs were required, but the damage would have been much worse had the fire occurred only a month later. This was an inauspicious start for the Georges Philippar, but it was only the start of a short and troubled career. During the time leading up to her maiden voyage, French police received threats against the Georges Philippar. Specifically, they learned of a plan to blow up the ship as it passed through the Suez Canal. Some believe the ship was transporting munitions to Japan to help them fight communism in Soviet-backed Chinese territories. French authorities searched the ship but found nothing, and the ship's maiden voyage from Marseille on February 26, 1932, went forward as planned. Guided by Captain Anton Wieck, the Georges Philippar left Marseille and passed through the Suez Canal without incident, arriving at Yokohama, Japan on the 14th of April. Due to civil unrest in Yokohama, the ship did not stay long and soon left on its return journey to France. After stops at Shanghai, Saigon, and Ceylon, or modern-day Sri Lanka, she continued west through the Indian Ocean. As the ship traveled west, a fire alarm went off on 2 different occasions in a storage room containing gold bullion. Each time, the room and the alarm were inspected, and nothing at all was found. Records indicate the alarm went off for, quote, no accountable reason. On the evening of the 15th of May, passengers were celebrating Pentecost well into the evening. At 1:30 a.m. on May 16th, the ship was entering the Gulf of Aden. Just 15 minutes later, at 1:45 a.m., a fire was reported on D-deck, first-class cabins, in the cabin of Madame Valentine, the wife of one of the ship's engineers. The fire had apparently started from a spark from faulty electrical equipment and ignited the wood paneling. Several of the crew attempted to fight the fire and believed it was under control, so the fire was not reported to Captain Wieck. Roughly 30 minutes later, the fire was getting out of control and was finally reported. Captain Wieck immediately rushed to the scene, where he discovered the fire had already spread to other parts of the ship. He ordered SOS messages to be sent, and the alarm sounded. Wieck brought the ship around downwind and ordered the engine stopped, and watertight hatches and doors to be closed. He was able to launch 2 lifeboats just minutes before they would have been destroyed by fire, and also 4 boats from the poop deck. Just after the SOS distress signal was attempted, flames engulfed the radio station and electrical generating station on the upper deck. The engineers were ordered to shut down the electrical systems to stop the fire from spreading through the many conduits, but it was too late. It was still early in the morning hours and almost everyone was asleep in their cabins. Passengers began experiencing smoke in their cabins and passageways, and those who could began gathering on the top deck. The closing of the watertight doors was necessary, but unfortunately trapped some of the passengers. On D-deck, passengers did not have time to escape and were either asphyxiated or scrambled out of their portholes and into the water. The captain and crew desperately attempted to fight the fire, but their efforts were ineffective. As the situation deteriorated, panicked passengers jumped into the sea, while others rushed back to their cabins to retrieve their valuables, only to become trapped. Blood-curdling screams of agony and terror could be heard from those trapped in their cabins, but there was nothing that could be done for them. Helpless to save them, the crew focused on the passengers who were able to escape to the main deck. Passengers were hurried into the lifeboats in an orderly fashion, but as quickly as possible as the fire raged. Some of the lifeboats were engulfed in flames, and others had to be doused with water to prevent them from igniting. Lifeboats were boarded in the traditional manner, with women and children boarding first, followed by male passengers, and lastly, the crew. Those who jumped into the water were brought on board the lifeboats, as well as others who escaped out of the portholes and were clinging to ropes and fire hoses. Captain Wieck personally checked every cabin that could still be reached to make sure nobody was on board who could still be saved. His face and legs were badly burned in the process, but he continued to direct the evacuation. At 8:00 a.m., Captain Wieck was the last to leave the ship. He joined the rest of the survivors in the lifeboats and rowed away from the flaming hulk that was once under his command. The Gulf of Aden is a highly trafficked waterway, and the Soviet tanker Sovietskaya Neft was the first to arrive on the scene. Its captain sent out a distress signal of its own and immediately began rescuing survivors from the lifeboats. Included among those who boarded the Sovietskaya was Monsieur Julien and his family. The Soviet tanker rescued about 400 people and stayed on the scene until midday, making sure there were no more survivors. It departed for Aden and arranged a rendezvous with the French passenger vessel André Le. Survivors were transferred from the Sovietskaya to the André Le and then taken to Djibouti. From there, they were transferred to the vessels General Voiron, the Cap Turan, and the Sarbouchen for their return to France. 2 British freighters, the Contractor and Massoud, rescued about 250 people combined, and both of those vessels made for Aden in Yemen. Several passengers died while en route to Aden and were buried at sea. The survivors were put on board the British P&O liner Cormoran for their return to France. The Japanese vessel Hakone Maru also participated in the rescue, pulling survivors from the water and from lifeboats. A photo of the flaming Georges Philippar was taken from on board the Hakone Maru and can be seen on this episode's show page on shipwrecksandseadogs.com. Survivors stated they saw a rowboat with about 70 people heading for Cape Guardafui. The government of Italian Somalia investigated and found no evidence of survivors or any vessel being discovered. Their fate is unknown. One couple who survived the fire did not wish to travel on another ship and chose instead to board a small plane. Their plane crashed outside of Rome, killing all on board. Ultimately, the survivors arrived at Marseille on the 27th of May, but were remarkably delayed from disembarking due to an outbreak of smallpox. Officially, the number of dead was placed at 41, but other estimates range from between 50 and 100. Some fourth-class passengers as well as servants were unaccounted for and considered missing. The official number of survivors was placed at 676. After the ship was abandoned, it continued aimlessly drifting northeast as it continued to burn. The Georges Philippar went down 3 days later on the 19th of May, 1932, in about 1,800 feet of water, roughly 50 miles off the coast of Yemen. It went down with $160 million of gold bullion that was loaded in Saigon. The insurance payout for the Georges Philippar was £1.25 million and was paid to Messageries Maritimes within a week of the accident. However, the insurance companies requested a copy of the investigation report when it was concluded, in order for them to be certain of their liability. The report was completed on August 6, 1932, but was not forwarded to the insurance companies in England. Consequently, the companies requested the return of all funds paid to the shipowner. This coincided with civil lawsuits from the families of the victims against Messageries Maritimes. In France, there was a great sadness and outrage. The public demanded a government inquiry into the loss of this beautiful ship, the new pride of the French passenger fleet. During the inquiry, another ship built by Ateliers et Chantiers was destroyed by fire, in quite remarkable circumstances. On 13th November 1932, the MS Pieter Cornelisson Hooft was in port at Amsterdam, being fumigated due to a rat infestation. All its portholes and hatches were shut, and a yellow warning flag with 3 black crosses was flown, warning all, quote, "Do not enter." At 10:15 p.m., a single man entered the ship to open the portholes, start up the fans and ventilation to air out the ship, and to start up the ship's dynamo. Shortly after, a fire was spotted in the first-class cabins. Within 40 minutes, the entire ship was ablaze. A massive effort was launched by Amsterdam firefighters, and so much water was poured onto the ship that it began to list. Fearing catastrophe, the ship was towed offshore, when the oil on the ship caught fire and ignited another massive explosion. The ship burned for almost 2 days straight before workers could approach and try to refloat her. During these repairs, a spark from an acetylene torch ignited an oil line and the ship once again went ablaze and burned for another 24 hours. The fire intensified a third time on the 17th of December, a fourth time on the 21st, and again on the 22nd, when a pocket of oil caught fire. The Hoofd had burned for a total of 10 days. If this wasn't bad enough, a third Ateliers et Chantiers ship was plagued by fire. This time, it was the SS L'Atlantique, which caught fire about 25 miles off Guernsey on the 4th of January, 1933. The fire spread rapidly and killed 19 of the ship's crew. After 4 long days, the fire burned itself out. An additional 5 crewmen were found burned to death on the lower decks. 3 ships built by Ateliers et Chantiers were all destroyed by intense fires within 8 months of each other. These were crushing losses and embarrassments for the shipbuilder. Finally, in May of 1933, a year after the accident, the insurance companies received the accident report, despite portions of it being omitted by the French Ministry of Marine. It concluded that the fire was started by a faulty electrical system, and placed the blame on the captain and crew for failing to act in a timely manner, even going so far as to label them incompetent. An official court inquiry was eventually launched. Captain Vic and other officers and crew of the Georges Philippar were summoned to testify, along with Colonel Pouderoux, the fire chief in Paris, as an expert witness. Vic testified that the only electrical problems on board were those in the kitchen, and repairs to those appliances were made in Yokohama. In fact, a fire near the swimming pool had to be extinguished just days before the accident. Later, shipyard workers testified that the electrical plant of the Georges Philippar was troublesome from the start, and they recommended repairs before the ship's maiden voyage, but those requests were denied. Vic praised the actions of his crew, retelling how his ensign dove into the water to save a child and subsequently lost his own life. However, some survivors claimed the ship's alarm was not loud enough to be heard on all parts of the ship, and others claimed it was never sounded at all. Ultimately, the inquiry determined, quote, catastrophic fire initiated by a malfunction in the high-voltage DC power grid of the ship. The ship's wood panels, curtains, carpeting, wood stairs, and other items were extremely flammable, and it was recommended to ban these items in the design of future ships. Captain Vic and the crew were fully exonerated of any wrongdoing. Another point made by the inquiry was the problematic use of DC current, which suffers from an inefficient loss of energy in the form of heat at higher voltage, and a recommendation was made to switch to alternating current. The SS Normandy was one of the first French ships to benefit from these new guidelines, with an alternating current power plant, upgraded firefighting equipment, and modern circuit breakers. In 1942, during World War II, the Normandy was seized by the United States, reassigned to the United States Coast Guard in New York, and renamed the USS Lafayette. While being converted on the Hudson River, the ship caught fire when a spark ignited nearby life vests and burned out of control. The ship rolled on her side, killing 1 guardsman and injuring hundreds. Controversy and rumors surrounded the sinking of the Georges Philippar. At this time of the 20th century, tension was again growing in Europe and Asia. Kingdoms, empires, and republics were jostling for position following World War I. In Asia, Japan was asserting its dominance over the region both militarily and politically, and European nations were concerned with their territorial interests all over Asia. One of the passengers of the Georges Philippar was a French journalist named Albert Londres, who had boarded the ship in China to return to France. Biographer Pierre Assouline suggests that Londres was in China investigating a potential scandal involving drugs, arms, and Bolshevik interference in Chinese affairs. Londres was killed in the fire of the Georges Philippar, and all of his notes were destroyed. Londres was seen by the ship's second engineer trying to escape out of the porthole in his cabin. The engineer threw him a fire hose to grab, but Londres either fell back into his cabin or into the sea. Some believe the ship was intentionally set on fire to kill Londres and prevent him from exposing what he knew. Other conspiracies were rampant as well, including Chinese sabotage, a Ceylon-based communist attack on capitalism, and a connection between the assassination of French President Paul Demise 10 days before the fire on board the Georges Philippar. The facts tell us the fire was caused by an unsafe electrical system hidden behind highly flammable wood paneling. If there was a conspiracy, no supporting evidence was ever produced. A surviving passenger testified that a bomb had been placed on board when the ship stopped at Port Said on its outbound journey. But neither inspectors nor Egyptian police and Messageries Maritimes officials knew anything about this. In July of 1934, the British crews of the contractor and Mossad were awarded the Médaille de Sauvetage, one of the highest awards given by the French for life-saving at sea. The masters of the two ships received gold medals, while the crews received silver medals. Civil lawsuits were brought against Messageries Maritimes by the English insurance companies and several families of the victims, including the wife of Albert Londres. After 10 years of proceedings, judgments were awarded to the plaintiffs, and the Ateliers and Chantiers shipbuilders were ordered to pay 50% of these judgments. Ateliers and Chantiers Shipbuilding Company continued on after several mergers until 1987, when it was permanently closed. The Messageries Maritimes Company continued operating until the French government merged it with its other state-owned shipping company, forming Compagnie Générale Maritime. As of 2023, it is the third largest shipping company in the world. I hope you have enjoyed the story of the Georges Philippar. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, and tell a friend. It only takes a moment of your time and would mean so much to me. You can follow Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ShipwrecksPod, and on Mastodon at shipwreckspod@sea.im. For episodes, show notes, photos, and sources, please visit shipwrecksandseadogs.com. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow him on YouTube at SeanSecret or on the web at sean.siegfried.se. Please join me again in 2 weeks for another episode of Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Until then, don't forget to test your onboard fire extinguishers. And also, wear your life jackets.